February 3, 1945. The air above Manila hung heavy with smoke and ash, the kind that settles in your lungs and doesn't leave for days. In the eastern district of Santo Tomas, behind walls that had contained 3 years of suffering, a convoy of American Sherman tanks rolled through gates that had been locked since January 1942. The grinding of treads against cobblestone echoed like thunder after a long drought. Inside the internment camp, beneath the skeletal remains of what had once been the Santo Tomas University, women pressed themselves against the walls of their barracks. They had learned, in 37 months of captivity, that the sound of boots meant danger, that the appearance of soldiers meant pain, that to be noticed was to invite catastrophe, that these boots sounded different, heavier, more deliberate, and when the doors opened, flooding the dim interior with tropical sunlight, the women did not move. They could not move. 3 years of systematic dehumanization had taught them to disappear, to become shadows, to exist as numbers rather than names. When the first American soldier stepped into that barrack, removing his helmet in the doorway as one might do when entering a church, he spoke words that seemed to come from another universe entirely. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "you're safe now. You're going home." The silence that followed was not the silence of relief. It was the silence of incomprehension. It was the sound of human beings who had forgotten they were human, confronted suddenly with someone who remembered for them. This moment, repeated in hundreds of prison camps across the Pacific Theater in the closing months of World War II, represented something more profound than military liberation. It was a collision of ideologies so fundamental, so absolute, that those who experienced it found themselves unable to speak, unable to process what was happening to them. For the women who had survived the Japanese internment camps of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and China, the American treatment upon liberation was not merely unexpected, it was philosophically impossible according to everything they had been taught, everything they had witnessed, everything their captors had drilled into them about their place in the imperial order of existence. To understand that silence, that paralysis of comprehension that gripped thousands of women in the moment of their liberation, one must first understand what they had endured, what they had become, and what the Japanese military system had systematically attempted to erase from their consciousness. The story of these women is not simply a tale of survival. It is a documentation of what happens when one civilization's concept of human dignity encounters another's complete negation of it. The Japanese Empire entered World War II with a military philosophy that had been refined over decades of expansion, a philosophy rooted in concepts that dated back to the Meiji Restoration and earlier, to the rigid hierarchies of the Tokugawa period and the samurai code of Bushido. But the Bushido that governed the Imperial Japanese Army in the 1940s was not the romanticized version that would later appear in Western films. It was a brutal, hierarchical system that placed the emperor at the apex of a pyramid of descending value, with each tier owing absolute obedience to the tier above and entitled to absolute dominance over the tier below. Within this system, prisoners of war occupied a space below that of animals. They were beings who had violated the most sacred principle of the code by surrendering rather than dying. They were, in the most literal sense the Japanese military could conceive, already dead. They were ghosts walking in bodies that should have been corpses when Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands in the winter and spring of 1941 and 1942. They captured not only military personnel, but tens of thousands of civilian women, children, and elderly. European colonists, American missionaries, teachers, nurses, businesswomen, and families who had built lives in places like Manila, Singapore, Batavia, and Shanghai suddenly found themselves categorized as enemy nationals. The Japanese military had no infrastructure prepared for them, no plan for their maintenance, and more importantly, no philosophical framework that acknowledged their humanity. These women were not prisoners in any Western sense. They were embarrassments. They were mouth breathers consuming resources. They were obstacles to be warehoused until they could be forgotten. The camps established to contain them were not designed for long-term habitation. Santo Tomas in Manila, Changi in Singapore, Jiding in Batavia, these places had been schools, military barracks, or hastily erected bamboo compounds. They became holding pens where thousands of women were crammed into spaces designed for hundreds. Daily rations were calculated not for sustenance, but for the minimum caloric intake necessary to prevent immediate death. In Santo Tomas, by 1944, The daily ration per person had dropped to 700 calories. In Jiding, it fell below 500. For context, a sedentary adult woman requires approximately 1800 calories to maintain basic metabolic function. The women were not being fed. They were being allowed to slowly starve while remaining technically alive. But the physical deprivation, as devastating as it was, formed only one component of a larger systematic assault on identity. The Japanese camp administrators implemented a regime designed not merely to contain but to transform. Women were forbidden to use their names. They became numbers, called out during Tenko, the daily roll calls that could last for hours under the tropical sun. They were required to bow, not simply as a gesture of respect but as a full 90-degree angle of submission, to any Japanese soldier or administrator they encountered, regardless of rank. Failure to bow, or bowing insufficiently, resulted in immediate physical punishment. Slapping was the minimum response. Prolonged kneeling on gravel, standing at attention for hours, public beatings with bamboo rods, these became daily occurrences. The women learned quickly what every prisoner learns. Visibility is danger. To be noticed is to be punished. The safest course is to become invisible, to move through the camp like a ghost, to avoid eye contact, to speak only when spoken to volunteer for nothing, to take up as little space as possible in the universe. They learn to shuffle rather than walk, to keep their heads down, to suppress any expression that might be interpreted as defiance or independence. They learned, in the most literal sense, to dehumanize themselves as a survival strategy. Many of these women were from backgrounds of privilege and education. They had been teachers, nurses, businesswomen, missionaries, the wives of plantation managers and colonial administrators. They had employed servants, made decisions, exercised authority in their pure lives. The transformation they underwent was not merely physical, though the starvation, the tropical diseases, the lack of medical care ravaged their bodies. It was psychological. Month by month, year by year, the camp system ground away at their sense of self until many could no longer remember who they had been. They existed in a perpetual present tense of survival, each day focused entirely on obtaining enough food to see another sunrise, on avoiding the attention of guards, on treating the dysentery and malaria and beriberi that swept through the barracks in waves. The food became an obsession naturally, inevitably. When the human body is deprived of adequate nutrition for months and years, the mind narrows its focus to a singular imperative. The women talked about food constantly. They shared recipes from their previous lives, describing in meticulous detail the preparation of meals they could no longer imagine actually tasting. They dreamed about food. They hallucinated about food. A piece of spoiled vegetable became a treasure. A spoonful of rice with weevils in it was consumed gratefully, protein being protein regardless of its source. Mothers watched their children's bellies swell with the paradoxical bloating of malnutrition, the body consuming its own muscle tissue to stay alive, the limbs becoming stick-thin while the abdomen distended. And through it all, the camp administrators maintained that this was not cruelty. This was order. This was the natural hierarchy asserting itself. The women were receiving exactly what they deserved according to their position in the structure of reality that the Japanese military had constructed. They were being allowed to live, which was more than they had earned by their surrender, by their failure to die honorably. The guards did not view themselves as sadists. They viewed themselves as administrators of a system, enforcers of a natural law that placed the emperor and his subjects at the center of the universe and all others in descending orbits of irrelevance. By 1945, when the American advance was pushing the Japanese defensive perimeter back toward the home islands, the women in these camps had been prisoners for more than 3 years. An entire generation of children had grown up knowing nothing but captivity. They could not remember a time before hunger, before the daily tenko, before the bowing and the beatings. For the adults, the psychological transformation was complete. They were no longer the people they had been in 1941. They were survivors, yes, but survivors who had been systematically taught that their survival depended on their acceptance of their own worthlessness. They had internalized the hierarchy. They had learned to believe, on some level that bypassed conscious thought, that they were indeed numbers, that they existed at the pleasure of their captors, that to expect anything beyond minimal survival was to indulge in dangerous fantasy. The American military that advanced across the Pacific toward these camps operated from a philosophical foundation that could not have been more different if it had been designed on another planet. The United States had entered World War II with its own complexities and contradictions, certainly. The nation that preached equality still practiced segregation. The army that spoke of freedom had interned its own Japanese-American citizens. But beneath these contradictions lay a bedrock principle encoded in the nation's founding documents, however imperfectly implemented: the inherent dignity of the individual human being. The idea that rights were not granted by the state but were intrinsic to human existence, that even enemies possessed certain inviolable characteristics that had to be respected. This was not sentimentality. It was not naivete. American soldiers in the Pacific had experienced the brutal reality of Japanese military culture firsthand. They had seen the results of the Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had died from exposure, starvation, and outright execution. They had witnessed kamikaze attacks, had fought against an enemy that seemed to prefer death to surrender in ratios that defied Western military logic. They had liberated islands where Japanese civilians had thrown themselves and their children off cliffs rather than face capture. They knew intimately that they were fighting a force that operated from a different moral universe, but the American military doctrine, shaped by the Geneva Conventions and by a cultural inheritance that valued individual human dignity, maintained specific protocols for the treatment of prisoners and liberated civilians. These were not suggestions. They were orders, drilled into soldiers from basic training forward. Prisoners were to be treated humanely. The wounded were to receive medical care. Women and children were to be protected. Food and water were to be provided immediately upon liberation. These directives were backed by the United States industrial capacity, which by 1945 had achieved a level of productive output that staggered the imagination. America could afford to be humane, because America had resources that seemed, to those who had been starving, literally infinite. The soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, the 37th Infantry Division, the 11th Airborne Division, who rolled into Manila and other Philippine camps in early 1945, who parachuted into Los Baños, who fought house to house through the ruins of the city to reach Santo Tomas, had been briefed on what they would find. They had been told about the starvation, about the disease, about the conditions. But briefings cannot prepare human beings for the reality of systematic dehumanization. When these young American soldiers, most of them in their early 20s, many of them from farms in Iowa and factories in Ohio and small towns across a nation that had never experienced enemy occupation, walked into those camps and saw what 3 years of captivity had done to women and children who looked like their mothers and sisters, the psychological impact was profound. The official after-action reports are dry documents, written in the flat language of military bureaucracy. But the personal letters, the diaries, the oral histories collected decades later reveal the shock, the anger, the overwhelming compassion that these soldiers felt. They described women who weighed 70 pounds, skeletal figures with skin stretched over bone, eyes that seemed too large for their skulls. They described children with the distended bellies of starvation, too weak to stand, covered in tropical sores. They described the smell of disease and human waste, the flies, the heat, the overcrowding. And they described something else, something harder to quantify in official reports: the psychological damage, the way the prisoners flinched at sudden movements, the way they would not make eye contact, the way they seemed more afraid of liberation than they had been of continued captivity. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Field kitchens were set up within hours. Medical personnel began triage. Supplies poured in from the massive logistical chain that supported the Pacific Campaign. The soldiers gave away their own rations, their chocolate bars, their cigarettes. They carried women who could not walk. They held children who had forgotten what kindness looked like. And they insisted, with a firmness that seemed almost aggressive to the prisoners, on a radical proposition that these people, these starving numbers, were human beings entitled to dignity and care. It was in this collision of philosophies that the silence occurred. When American soldiers addressed the women as ma'am, when they asked permission before entering a barrack, when they offered food and medical care and insisted that the women should eat first, should rest, should allow themselves to be helped, these actions did not compute. They violated every lesson that 3 years of captivity had taught. They were incompatible with the reality that the women had constructed to survive. Margaret Shirk, a missionary teacher who had been imprisoned in Santo Tomas with her mother and siblings, later wrote about the moment of liberation with a precision That captured the psychological dislocation. When the American soldiers came through the gate, she wrote, I felt fear, not relief. Fear, because I did not understand what was happening. For 3 years, soldiers had meant danger. They had meant pain. They had meant that you must bow, that you must become small, that you must not be noticed. And here were soldiers, behaving in a way that made no sense. They were smiling. They were crying. They were calling us by our names, using Miss and Mrs. like we were real people. I stood there, and I could not move because my mind could not reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true about the world. This paralysis, this cognitive dissonance, manifested in different ways across different women. Some burst into tears, overwhelming emotion breaking through years of enforced stoicism. Some laughed, hysterical laughter that came from a place beyond joy or relief. But many simply stood silent, frozen, unable to process the information their senses were providing. They had been numbers for so long that the reinstatement of their humanity felt not like liberation, but like another form of violence, an assault on the protective emotional armor they had built. The American soldiers did not understand this at first. They expected gratitude, relief, celebration. What they encountered instead was this strange quiet, this hesitation, this fear in the eyes of people who were supposedly being rescued. Some of the women refused food, conditioned to believe that accepting anything without permission would result in punishment. Some continued to bow to the American soldiers, deeply and repeatedly, unable to break the reflex that had been beaten into them. Some asked in whispers if they were truly allowed to leave the camp or if this was a test, a trap, another form of torture. The psychological literature on captivity and liberation, developed extensively in the decades following World War II, has documented this phenomenon repeatedly. The human mind adapts to captivity by creating a survival framework, a set of rules and behaviors that keep the person alive. That framework becomes reality. It becomes the truth of the universe. When that framework is suddenly invalidated, when the rules change completely and without warning, the mind experiences a form of trauma that can be as devastating as the original captivity. Liberation is not a simple reversal of imprisonment. It is a second trauma, requiring a second adaptation, a second transformation of identity. For the women in the camps, the American insistence on their humanity was terrifying because it required them to become human again. It required them to take up space, to have needs, to express desires, to make decisions. For 3 years, they had survived by doing the opposite, by taking up no space, by having no needs beyond the minimum, by expressing no desires, by making no decisions beyond the immediate question of survival. To suddenly be told that they should eat as much as they wanted, that they should rest, that they should allow themselves to be cared for, this was asking them to abandon every survival strategy they had developed. The food became the symbol of this transformation, the physical manifestation of the philosophical collision. The American field rations, the C rations and K rations, and the hot meals prepared by field kitchens, represented abundance on a scale that seemed obscene to women who had been surviving on handfuls of rice and watery vegetable soup. A single C ration contained more calories than many of the women had consumed in a week. The variety meat, vegetables, fruit, chocolate, coffee, sugar was incomprehensible. The Americans distributed this food freely, casually, with an abundance that suggested infinite supply. They did not ration it jealously. They did not make the women beg for it. They simply gave it, and then gave more when the first supply was consumed. Many of the women could not eat. Their stomachs, shrunken from years of inadequate nutrition, could not process the richness of the American food. They vomited. They experienced severe cramps. Medical personnel had to implement controlled refeeding protocols, slowly increasing caloric intake to avoid refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition where the body's systems, adapted to starvation, are overwhelmed by sudden nutrition. But even beyond the physical limitations, there was a psychological barrier. The women could not believe the food was real, that it was truly for them, that there would be more tomorrow. They hoarded it, hiding pieces of food in their clothing, in their meager possessions, unable to trust that the abundance was genuine. The Americans watched this hoarding with compassion and incomprehension. They could not understand why women would hide food when there were tons of it available, when more was arriving daily. But for the women, hoarding was survival. It was the strategy that had kept them alive when a hidden scrap of vegetable could mean the difference between life and death. The trust required to stop hoarding, To believe in the American promise of continued supply was more than many could manage in those first days and weeks. The military nurses who arrived with the liberating forces played a crucial role in the psychological transition. These American women, healthy and strong, wearing uniforms and boots, moving with confidence and authority, represented what the prisoners had been before captivity. They were mirrors showing a possible future, proof that women could exist as full human beings with agency and dignity. The nurses addressed the prisoners as equals, spoke to them about their needs, involved them in decisions about their own care. This was revolutionary. Lieutenant Agnes Palmer, an army nurse with the 126th General Hospital, kept a detailed journal of her time treating liberated prisoners in Manila. She wrote extensively about the psychological challenges, about women who could not make decisions about their own medical treatment because they had been conditioned to have no opinions. I would ask a woman, Palmer wrote, what she needed, if she was in pain, if she preferred one treatment over another, and she would stare at me as if I was speaking a foreign language, not because she didn't understand English, but because she could not comprehend that her preference mattered, that she was being consulted about her own body. I realized after several days that I had to change my approach. I had to tell them what we were going to do, firmly but kindly, because giving them choices was actually causing them distress. They had forgotten how to have choices. This observation, repeated by medical personnel across multiple liberation sites, points to a fundamental aspect of the dehumanization process. The Japanese camp system had not simply deprived the women of resources, it had deprived them of agency, of the ability to make decisions, of the right to preferences. Everything had been dictated to them: when to wake, when to sleep, when to bow, where to stand, what to eat. The reintroduction of choice, of personal agency, was not immediately liberating. It was destabilizing. The American soldiers, for their part, struggled with the emotional weight of what they were witnessing. Many of these young men had been raised in the cultural context of 1942 America, where women were to be protected, where children were innocent, where certain things were simply not done to civilians. The evidence of systematic abuse, of deliberate starvation, of casual cruelty, violated their understanding of warfare. The Pacific Campaign had already been brutal, characterized by a level of violence and mutual hatred that exceeded even the European theater in many respects. But the treatment of the civilian prisoners struck these soldiers as something beyond warfare, something that approached evil in its systematic nature. The anger was palpable in the days following liberation. There were incidents of American soldiers executing Japanese guards and administrators found in or near the camps. Summary justice delivered before official military tribunals could be convened. The official records acknowledge some of these incidents obliquely, referring to difficulties with prisoner processing and unfortunate confrontations. The unofficial accounts, the stories passed down in family histories and recorded in oral history projects, are more direct. American soldiers saw what had been done to women and children who looked like their own families, and some of them responded with immediate violence. The military command made efforts to restrain this, to insist on proper procedures for war crimes trials, but in the immediate aftermath of liberation, in the chaos of urban combat and the overwhelming emotional impact of the camps, control was imperfect. Yet for every act of vengeance, there were hundreds of acts of compassion. Soldiers sharing their letters from home, reading them to women who had been cut off from news of the outside world for years. Mechanics and engineers improvising repairs to the camp infrastructure, fixing water systems and electrical lines, and creating improvised showers so the women could bathe in privacy. Chaplains conducting services for every denomination, providing spiritual care alongside physical care. Supply sergeants who somehow managed to locate clothing, shoes, personal hygiene items. The small dignities that institutional care often overlooks. The transformation of the camps from prisons to refugee centers happened with remarkable speed. Within days, the Tenko was replaced by voluntary assembly for information and meal distribution. The barracks were cleaned, repaired, made as comfortable as circumstances allowed. Medical facilities were established with equipment and medications that seemed to the prisoners like science fiction compared to the handful of aspirin and bandages that had constituted the medical supplies under Japanese administration. Women began to gain weight slowly, carefully monitored by medical staff. The tropical sores began to heal. The dysentery came under control with proper sanitation and medication, but the psychological healing took longer. Weeks into liberation, Women still bowed reflexively to anyone in uniform. They still flinched at sudden noises. They still hoarded food despite the daily evidence that more would be provided. They still struggled to use their names, to assert their identities, to occupy the space of full human beings. The camp administrators, now American military personnel, found themselves dealing not with logistics of containment, but with the complex process of psychological rehabilitation. How do you teach someone to be human again when they have forgotten what that means? The children presented a particular challenge and a particular hope. The youngest children, those born in the camps or imprisoned as infants, had no memory of a world before captivity. For them, bowing to soldiers was normal. Hunger was normal. The absence of play, of laughter, of the spontaneous joy that characterizes childhood was normal. The American soldiers, many of whom had children of their own back home, found the condition of these children particularly devastating. They responded with an outpouring of attention, sharing their rations, improvising toys from scrap materials, organizing games and activities that many of the children initially did not understand how to participate in. There is a photograph, widely circulated in American newspapers in March 1945, of a soldier from the 1st Cavalry Division sitting on the ground surrounded by a group of children from Santo Tomas. He is teaching them how to play baseball, using a makeshift ball and bat. The children are skeletal, their eyes too large, their clothes hanging on their frames, but they are smiling tentatively, as if testing whether joy is permitted. The soldier's face shows concentration mixed with sorrow. He is trying to give these children a piece of normal childhood, trying to show them that the world contains more than hunger and fear. The photograph became iconic, reproduced on posters for war bond drives, used in the military's public relations efforts. But the reality it captured was more complex than propaganda. The children recovered faster than the adults in some ways, slow in others. Their bodies, still young and resilient, responded well to proper nutrition and medical care. Within weeks, they were running, playing, exhibiting the energy of normal childhood. But the psychological scars were deep. Many suffered from night terrors, from hypervigilance, from attachment disorders. They had learned not to trust adults, had watched adults be powerless to protect them, had internalized their lesson that authority figures were sources of danger. The American soldiers and relief workers had to earn trust slowly, demonstrating through consistent action that they were different, that they could be relied upon. For the older children, adolescents who had entered the camps as children and were emerging as teenagers, the psychological dislocation was profound. They had missed years of education, of social development, of the gradual process of identity formation that characterizes adolescence. They were neither children nor adults, trapped in a developmental limbo by their captivity. Many of them took on caretaker roles, protective of younger siblings and other children, displaying a maturity born of necessity but ill-equipped for normal teenage life. The reintegration programs developed by relief organizations struggled to address their needs, caught between treating them as traumatized children and as young adults with their own agency. The women watched their children begin to recover and experienced a complex mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the nightmare was ending, that their children would survive, that the future might hold something better than their survival. But grief for the childhood that had been stolen, for the years that could never be recovered, for the innocence that had been taken. Some women described feeling that they had failed as mothers, that they had been unable to protect their children from the horrors of captivity. The American medical personnel and chaplains worked to address this guilt, to help the women understand that survival itself had been an act of profound maternal love, that they had done what was necessary under impossible circumstances. As the weeks turned to months and the logistical machinery of repatriation began to function, the women faced a new challenge, returning to a world that had moved on without them. 3 years had passed. Husbands and fathers had died, in combat or in other camps. Homes had been destroyed in the fighting that liberated the Philippines. The colonial world they had known, the structure of privilege and power that had defined their pure lives, was ending. The war had accelerated the process of decolonization, had demonstrated that the European empires were not invincible, had empowered independence movements across Asia. The women would be returning not to the world they had left, but to something new and uncertain. The American military made efforts to prepare them, providing information about there was progress, about the state of their home countries, about the repatriation process. but information could not fully prepare them for the emotional reality of return. Many of the women had spent their captivity focused entirely on survival, on making it through one more day. They had not allowed themselves to think about the future because the future was too uncertain, too painful to contemplate. Now, forced to consider what came next, they experienced a crisis of purpose. What do you do after you have survived the unsurvivable? Who are you when the framework that defined your existence for 3 years is suddenly removed? Some women chose to stay in the Philippines or other parts of Asia, at least initially. They were not ready to face home, to answer questions, to try to explain what had happened to them. They took jobs with relief organizations, with military administration, with the nascent governments forming in the region. They used their language skills and their knowledge of the local cultures. Some married American soldiers they had met during liberation, finding in these relationships a chance to build new lives with people who had witnessed, at least partially, what they had endured. These marriages were complicated, sometimes successful, sometimes disastrous. The men thought they were rescuing broken women who would be grateful. The women thought they were finding partners who understood trauma. The reality of building a relationship in the aftermath of catastrophe proved more difficult than either anticipated. Others returned to the United States, to Britain, to Australia, to the Netherlands, to whatever place they called home. They arrived to find themselves celebrated as heroines, as survivors, as symbols of national resilience. But they did not feel heroic. They felt hollowed out, uncertain, disconnected from the celebration. The public wanted stories of brave resistance, of noble suffering, of clear moral lessons. The reality was more ambiguous. They had survived largely by becoming passive, by submitting, by making themselves small. They had not resisted heroically. They had endured, and endurance, they discovered, was harder to narrate than resistance. Many chose silence. They returned to their families and they did not speak about what had happened. When asked, they provided minimal details, deflecting questions, changing subjects. The depth of their trauma remained hidden, sometimes for decades. They had nightmares. They had phobias. They could not bear waste, continuing to hoard food, to save every scrap, to wear clothes until they were threadbare. They could not tolerate authority, flinching from anyone who raised their voice or made sudden demands. They struggled with intimacy, with trust, with the vulnerability required for close relationships. But they did not connect these struggles to their experience. They simply lived with them, assuming this was how life would be now. The medical and psychological communities of the late 1940s and 1950s had limited understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept existed in primitive form, categorized as shell shock or combat neuroses, but it was associated primarily with soldiers in active combat. The idea that civilians, particularly women, could experience comparable psychological trauma from their experiences was not well developed. The women received medical care for their physical ailments, the tropical diseases, the malnutrition, the dental problems that resulted from years without proper care, but they received little systematic help for their psychological wounds. They were expected to simply move on, to be grateful to be alive, to reintegrate into normal life through force of will. The symbolic power of food remained with these women for the rest of their lives. In dozens of memoirs, in hundreds of oral history interviews, in countless family stories passed down through generations, the abundance of American food during liberation is recalled with an intensity that suggests religious experience. The chocolate bars, the canned meat, the white bread, the coffee with real sugar, these were not simply nutrients. They were manifestations of a different philosophy of human worth. They were proof that another kind of world existed, a world where resources were shared rather than hoarded, where feeding the hungry was considered a duty rather than a weakness. Elizabeth Vaughan, a missionary teacher who survived imprisonment in the Philippines with her 2 young children, wrote in her memoir about receiving her first American field ration. "I opened the tin," she wrote, "and the smell of the meat made me weep, not because I was hungry, though I was, but because some stranger in a factory in America, had packed this tin intending it to feed a soldier, and that soldier had given it to me instead." It represented a chain of generosity, of care, of the acknowledgement that my life had value, that my children's lives had value. For 3 years, we had been told, in every way possible, that we had no value. And here was this tin of meat, this simple thing, telling me something different, This symbolism extended beyond the immediate moment of liberation. Many of the survivors developed relationships with food that reflected their experience. Some became unable to throw away any food, filling their homes with stockpiles that could never be consumed, driven by the terror that the abundance might end, that starvation might return. Others went in the opposite direction, unable to hoard, needing to share any excess immediately, compulsively feeding neighbors and strangers, as if to exorcise the ghost of hunger through radical generosity. Some developed restrictive eating habits, their bodies unable to trust signals of hunger and fullness after years of forced deprivation. Food became not simply sustenance, but a battleground where the trauma of captivity was fought and refought across decades. The American soldiers who participated in the liberation carried their own trauma forward. Many spoke little about what they had seen in the camps, unable to articulate the horror without reliving it. They had gone to war expecting combat, expecting to face enemy soldiers in battle. They had not expected to encounter the results of systematic dehumanization, to witness what ideology unchecked by human compassion could produce. Some became activists, involved in early war crimes prosecutions, in efforts to document what had happened in veterans' organizations dedicated to ensuring that such atrocities would not be forgotten or repeated. Others simply tried to forget, to move on, to build lives that did not include the memories of skeletal women who flinched when spoken to kindly. The Japanese guards and administrators who survived faced trials for war crimes in the years following the war. The proceedings were complex, involving questions of command responsibility, of cultural context, of individual agency within a military system that demanded absolute obedience. Some defendants argued that they were following orders, that they had no choice, that the system itself was responsible rather than any individual. Others expressed genuine confusion at being charged with crimes, unable to understand what they had done wrong. They had maintained order. They had followed regulations. They had treated the prisoners according to the military's understanding of appropriate handling of enemy nationals who had surrendered. For the older children, adolescents who had entered the camps as children and were emerging as teenagers, the psychological dislocation was profound. They had missed years of education, of social development, of the gradual process of identity formation that characterizes adolescence. They were neither children nor adults, trapped in a developmental limbo by their captivity. Many of them took on caretaker roles, protective of younger siblings and other children, displaying a maturity born of necessity, but ill-equipped for normal teenage life. The reintegration programs developed by relief organizations struggled to address their needs, caught between treating them as traumatized children and as young adults with their own agency. The women watched their children begin to recover and experienced a complex mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the nightmare was ending, that their children would survive, that the future might hold something better than their survival. But grief for the childhood that had been stolen, for the years that could never be recovered, for the innocence that had been taken. Some women described feeling that they had failed as mothers, that they had been unable to protect their children from the horrors of captivity. The American medical personnel and chaplains worked to address this guilt, to help the women understand that survival itself had been an act of profound maternal love, that they had done what was necessary under impossible circumstances. As the weeks turned to months and the logistical machinery of repatriation began to function, the women faced a new challenge, returning to a world that had moved on without them. 3 years had passed. Husbands and fathers had died, in combat or in other camps. Homes had been destroyed in the fighting that liberated the Philippines. The colonial world they had known, the structure of privilege and power that had defined their pure lives, was ending. The war had accelerated the process of decolonization, had demonstrated that the European empires were not invincible, had empowered independence movements across Asia. The women would be returning not to the world they had left, but to something new and uncertain. The American military made efforts to prepare them, providing information about the war's progress, about the state of their home countries, about the repatriation process. But information could not fully prepare them for the emotional reality of return. Many of the women had spent their captivity focused entirely on survival, on making it through one more day. They had not allowed themselves to think about the future because the future was too uncertain, too painful to contemplate. Now, forced to consider what came next, they experienced a crisis of purpose. What do you do after you have survived the unsurvivable? Who are you when the framework that To find your existence for 3 years is suddenly removed. Some women chose to stay in the Philippines or other parts of Asia, at least initially. They were not ready to face home, to answer questions, to try to explain what had happened to them. They took jobs with relief organizations, with military administration, with the nascent governments forming in the region. They used their language skills and their knowledge of the local cultures. Some married American soldiers they had met during liberation, finding in these relationships a chance to build new lives with people who had witnessed, at least partially, what they had endured. These marriages were complicated, sometimes successful, sometimes disastrous. The men thought they were rescuing broken women who would be grateful. The women thought they were finding partners who understood trauma. The reality of building a relationship in the aftermath of catastrophe proved more difficult than either anticipated. Others returned to the United States, to Britain, to Australia, to the Netherlands, to whatever place they called home. They arrived to find themselves celebrated as heroines, as survivors, as symbols of national resilience. But they did not feel heroic. They felt hollowed out, uncertain, disconnected from the celebration. The public wanted stories of brave resistance, of noble suffering, of clear moral lessons. The reality was more ambiguous. They had survived largely by becoming passive, by submitting, by making themselves small. They had not resisted heroically. They had endured, and endurance, they discovered, was harder to narrate than resistance. Many chose silence. They returned to their families and they did not speak about what had happened. When asked, they provided minimal details, deflecting questions, changing subjects. The depth of their trauma remained hidden, sometimes for decades. They had nightmares. They had phobias. They could not bear waste, continuing to hoard food, to save every scrap, to wear clothes until they were threadbare. They could not tolerate authority, flinching from anyone who raised their voice or made sudden demands. They struggled with intimacy, with trust, with the vulnerability required for close relationships. But they did not connect these struggles to their experience. They simply lived with them, assuming this was how life would be now. The medical and psychological communities of the late 1940s and 1950 seconds had limited understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept existed in primitive form, categorized as shell shock or combat neuroses, but it was associated primarily with soldiers in active combat. The idea that civilians, particularly women, could experience comparable psychological trauma from their experiences was not well developed. The women received medical care for their physical ailments, the tropical diseases, the malnutrition, the dental problems that resulted from years without proper care. But they received little systematic help for their psychological wounds. They were expected to simply move on, to be grateful to be alive, to reintegrate into normal life through force of will. The symbolic power of food remained with these women for the rest of their lives. In dozens of memoirs, in hundreds of oral history interviews, in countless family stories passed down through generations, the abundance of American food during liberation is recalled with an intensity that suggests religious experience. The chocolate bars, the canned meat, the white bread, the coffee with real sugar, these were not simply nutrients. They were manifestations of a different philosophy of human worth. They were proof that another kind of world existed, a world where resources were shared rather than hoarded, where feeding the hungry was considered a duty rather than a weakness. Elizabeth Vaughan, a missionary teacher who survived imprisonment in the Philippines with her 2 young children, wrote in her memoir about receiving her first American field ration. "I opened the tin," she wrote, "and the smell of the meat made me weep. Not because I was hungry, though I was, but because some stranger in a factory in America, had packed this tin intending it to feed a soldier, and that soldier had given it to me instead." It represented a chain of generosity, of care, of the acknowledgement that my life had value, that my children's lives had value. For 3 years, we had been told, in every way possible, that we had no value. And here was this tin of meat, this simple thing, telling me something different. This symbolism extended beyond the immediate moment of liberation. Many of the survivors developed relationships with food that reflected their experience. Some became unable to throw away any food, filling their homes with stockpiles that could never be consumed, driven by the terror that the abundance might end, that starvation might return. Others went in the opposite direction, unable to hoard, needing to share any excess immediately, compulsively feeding neighbors and strangers, as if to exorcise the ghost of hunger through radical generosity. Some developed restrictive eating habits, their bodies unable to trust signals of hunger and fullness after years of forced deprivation. Food became not simply sustenance, but a battleground where the trauma of captivity was fought and refought across decades. The American soldiers who participated in the liberation carried their own trauma forward. Many spoke little about what they had seen in the camps, unable to articulate the horror without reliving it. They had gone to war expecting combat, expecting to face enemy soldiers in battle. They had not expected to encounter the results of systematic dehumanization, to witness what ideology unchecked by human compassion could produce. Some became activists, involved in early war crimes prosecutions, in efforts to document what had happened in veterans' organizations dedicated to ensuring that such atrocities would not be forgotten or repeated. Others simply tried to forget, to move on, to build lives that did not include the memories of skeletal women who flinched when spoken to kindly. The Japanese guards and administrators who survived faced trials for war crimes in the years following the war. The proceedings were complex, involving questions of command responsibility, of cultural context, of individual agency within a military system that demanded absolute obedience. Some defendants argued that they were following orders, that they had no choice, that the system itself was responsible rather than any individual. Others expressed genuine confusion at being charged with crimes, unable to understand what they had done wrong. They had maintained order. They had followed regulations. They had treated the prisoners according to the military's understanding of appropriate handling of enemy nationals who had surrendered. This lack of comprehension, this genuine inability to understand that what they had done constituted cruelty, reveals the depth of the philosophical divide. Within the framework of the Japanese military hierarchy, they had not been cruel. They had been correct. The prisoners were at the bottom of the hierarchy, and they had been treated according to their position. The American insistence that this treatment constituted a crime against humanity was, to them, an imposition of foreign values, an attempt to judge them by a standard they did not recognize. The trials proceeded, convictions were obtained, sentences were carried out, but the moral reckoning was incomplete because the two sides were arguing from incommensurable premises about the basic nature of human dignity. In the decades following the war, historians and psychologists have attempted to understand the phenomenon of systematic dehumanization, to categorize it, to explain how societies and institutions develop the capacity to treat human beings as objects. The women who survived the Japanese camps became case studies. Their experiences documented and analyzed. The research has identified patterns: the gradual erosion of identity through the removal of names and personal possessions, the use of physical degradation to break down self-concept, the creation of a hierarchy where survival depends on accepting one's inferior position, the intermittent reinforcement through unpredictable punishment and occasional mercy that makes victims bond with their captors, but the academic analysis, necessary as it is for understanding the mechanisms of dehumanization, cannot fully capture the lived experience. The silence that fell over those women when American soldiers called them ma'am when they were addressed as human beings rather than numbers was not a phenomenon that can be reduced to psychological principles. It was a moment of ontological crisis, a rupture in the structure of reality that had sustained them 3 years of horror. They had built a world where they were worthless in order to survive a world that treated them as worthless. When confronted with evidence that their world was false, that another reality was possible, they could not immediately cross the threshold. The silence was the sound of a self being rebuilt from fragments, of a human being emerging from the protective shell of numbness that had kept them alive. This rebuilding took different amounts of time for different women. Some adapted quickly, their sense of self proving more resilient than the camp system could destroy. Within weeks of liberation, they were making plans, asserting preferences, reclaiming their identities. Others took months, years, some never fully recovered, spending the rest of their lives in a kind of psychological limbo, unable to fully inhabit either the world of captivity or the world of freedom. They had been changed too fundamentally, had adapted too completely to survive, and the adaptation could not be undone simply because the circumstances had changed. The children of the survivors carried forward their own inheritance. Many grew up in households marked by silence, where the past was not discussed but was present in every anxiety, every inexplicable fear, every moment of parental overprotection or emotional distance. They learned, as children do, to work around the trauma, to avoid topics that would trigger their parents, to be grateful for the survival that had allowed them to exist. Some became historians, therapists, activists, driven by a need to understand what their parents could not explain. Others distanced themselves, unable to bear the weight of inherited trauma, building lives as different as possible from their parents' experience. The liberation of the camps has been portrayed in films, in books, in historical documentaries. These portrayals typically follow a narrative arc: the horror of captivity, the heroism of the liberators, the joy of freedom. This narrative is not false, but it is incomplete. It elides the complexity of liberation as a second trauma, the difficulty of transition, the ambiguity of survival. It suggests a clean break between before and after, when the reality was a long, difficult process of becoming human again. A process that for many was never fully complete. The women who survived left behind a scattered archive of their experience. Some wrote memoirs, published years or decades after liberation, when enough time had passed to allow them to articulate what had happened. These memoirs are remarkable documents, characterized by a tension between the desire to bear witness and the inability to fully convey the reality. Language, they discovered, was inadequate to the task. How do you describe starvation to someone who has always had enough to eat? How do you explain the psychological impact of bowing, day after day, month after month, until the act becomes automatic, until it shapes the way you understand your place in the universe? How do you communicate the texture of fear, the way it becomes background noise, the constant static of your existence? Others left oral histories, recorded by researchers interested in documenting the experience of civilian internees. These oral histories are different from memoirs, more spontaneous, more fragmented, but also more immediate in their emotional impact. The speakers interrupt themselves, correcting details, circling back to moments that seem trivial but carry profound symbolic weight. They describe the taste of the rice, the sound of the guards' boots, the smell of the tropical rain on the packed earth of the campgrounds. They cry, even 50 or 60 years after the fact, when describing certain moments: the death of a friend, the sight of their children's hunger, the moment when they realize they might not survive. The archival record also includes the military documents, the after-action reports, the medical records, the logistics manifests. These provide the skeleton of fact: dates, numbers, locations, procedures. 3,000 internees liberated at Santo Tomas on February 3, 1945. Average weight of adult women, 89 pounds. Mortality rate in camp during final year, 12%. Medical conditions requiring immediate treatment: malnutrition, dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, tropical ulcers, psychological trauma. These statistics are necessary for historical understanding, but they are also inadequate. They reduce lived experience to data points, individual suffering to aggregate numbers. The photographs provide another kind of evidence, visual testimony, that bypasses language. The images of liberation are difficult to view: skeletal figures in rags, children with distended bellies, the expressions of shock and uncertainty on faces that have forgotten how to hope. Equally powerful are the photographs, taken weeks or months later, showing the same women after weeks of care, their bodies filling out, their expressions transformed. The before and after comparison is striking, but it also obscures the psychological journey that the physical transformation represents. What emerges from this scattered archive is a story more complex than simple victimization or simple heroism. It is a story about the extremes of human experience, about what happens when ideological systems collide, about the resilience and fragility of human dignity. The women who survived were not exceptional heroes. They were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, who did what they had to do to survive, and who paid a price for that survival that extended across the rest of their lives. The philosophical question at the heart of their experience remains relevant. What does it mean to be human? Is human dignity inherent, as the American founding documents assert, or is it conferred by social structures, as the Japanese military hierarchy suggested? Can human dignity be erased by systematic dehumanization, or does it persist regardless of circumstances? The women's experience suggests that the answer is both. Human dignity is inherent in the sense that it cannot be completely destroyed, even after 3 years of systematic abuse. The women remained human beings with thoughts, feelings, relationships, the capacity for suffering and hope. But dignity is also socially constructed in the sense that it requires recognition by others to be fully realized. The women had to be reminded that they were human, had to be shown through the actions of their liberators that they possessed worth, that they deserved care and respect. This dual nature of human dignity, both inherent and socially constructed, explains the silence that fell when the American soldiers addressed the women as human beings. They were being confronted with something they had never lost, but had forgotten they possessed. The silence was recognition, delayed recognition, of their own humanity reflected back to them by others who saw them as something more than numbers, more than prisoners, more than the degraded creatures they had been forced to become. The abundance of American food symbolized this recognition in tangible form. The food was not simply nutrition, it was a statement of value. It said, "You matter enough to feed properly. You matter enough to receive not the minimum required to prevent death, but actual nourishment, actual care." The Japanese camp system had provided the minimum, and even that grudgingly, communicating through every bowl of watery rice that the prisoners were a burden, that they were consuming resources they had not earned. The American distribution of food communicated the opposite, that feeding the hungry was an obligation, that care was a duty, that human beings possessed inherent worth regardless of their circumstances. This ideological difference extended beyond food to every aspect of the liberation and repatriation process. The Americans asked the women what they needed. They provided clothing and allowed them to choose what to wear. They set up privacy screens for bathing and medical examinations. They addressed them by name and title. They involved them in decisions about their own care and future. These were small acts, individually insignificant perhaps, but collectively they rebuilt the structure of dignity that the camp system had systematically dismantled. The women learned, slowly, to accept this care, to believe in it, to trust that it would continue. The learning process was not smooth. There were setbacks, moments of regression when the old patterns reasserted themselves. But gradually, over weeks and months, they began to inhabit their humanity again. They began to express preferences, to make decisions, to assert their needs. They began to look American soldiers in the eye instead of at the ground. They began to use their names, their titles, their identities. They began to remember who they had been and to imagine who they might become. The epilogue to this story extends across generations. The women who survived carried forward their experience in ways seen and unseen. They raised children, built careers, contributed to their communities. They were teachers and nurses and businesswomen and mothers and grandmothers. To the casual observer, they were ordinary citizens of the post-war world, indistinguishable from anyone else. But they carried within them the knowledge of what human beings were capable of doing to each other, and what human beings were capable of doing for each other. Some became advocates, speaking at schools and universities about their experience, writing letters to politicians about human rights, supporting organizations that work to prevent genocide and mass atrocity. They felt a responsibility to bear witness, to ensure that what they had experienced would not be forgotten, would not be dismissed as ancient history. They understood that the capacity for systematic dehumanization did not end with the defeat of the Japanese Empire, that it was a permanent possibility in human affairs, requiring constant vigilance to prevent. Others chose quiet lives, focusing on the immediate and the personal rather than the political and the historical. They tended their gardens, raised their families, built small worlds of stability and care. But even in their private lives, they carried forward lessons from their experience. They taught their children about the importance of compassion, about the dignity owed to every human being regardless of circumstances. They demonstrated through their actions that survival was not just about physical endurance, but about maintaining one's humanity under pressure, about refusing to become what the dehumanizing system wanted you to become. The American soldiers who liberated them also carried the experience forward. Many stayed in the military, rising to positions of leadership, shaping policy and doctrine based on what they had witnessed. They ensured that the treatment of prisoners and civilians remained a core component of military training, that the Geneva Conventions were not merely legal documents, but operational reality. They understood that how an army treats those in its power says something fundamental about the values it claims to represent, about the civilization it claims to defend. Others left the military and returned to civilian life, but they brought with them a changed perspective. They had seen the consequences of ideological extremism, of systems that prioritized abstract principles over human dignity. They had seen what happened when the inherent worth of individuals was subordinated to the supposed needs of the state, or the empire, or the ideology, and they had seen that it was possible to maintain moral principles even in the chaos of war, that treating people humanely was not a luxury but a necessity, not a sign of weakness but of strength. The camps themselves were demolished, rebuilt, repurposed. Santo Tomas returned to being a university. Changi became a prison for Singapore's own criminal justice system. Jiding's buildings were torn down and replaced with modern development. The physical locations where the dehumanization occurred have largely disappeared from the landscape, but the memory persists in the archives, in the memoirs, in the oral histories, in the family stories passed down through generations. On February 3rd, every year since liberation, survivors and their descendants have gathered to commemorate the liberation of Santo Tomas. In the early years, thousands attended, women who had survived reuniting, sharing memories, grieving together for those who had not survived. As the decades passed and the survivors aged and died, the gatherings grew smaller. Children and grandchildren attended in place of their mothers and grandmothers. The stories were retold, the photographs circulated, the memories curated and preserved. At these gatherings, food has always played a central role. Tables are laden with abundance, not the rice and vegetables of captivity, but the rich, varied cuisine of normal life. It is a deliberate choice, a conscious rejection of the scarcity that defined the camp years. The survivors eat, and in eating, they perform an act of remembrance and of defiance. They remember what it was to be hungry, what it was to watch their children starve, what it was to be reduced to creatures who thought of nothing but the next meal. And they defy that memory by demonstrating that they survived, that they reclaimed their lives, that they are still here. The silence that fell over them when they were first called human has been replaced by speech. They talk, they laugh, they cry. They tell their stories, preserving them for future generations. They bear witness not only to the horror, but to the liberation, not only to the dehumanization, but to the recognition of their humanity. They understand that their experience contains a lesson that every generation must learn anew, that human dignity is both fragile and resilient, that it can be attacked but not entirely destroyed, that it requires constant affirmation and protection. The women who survived the camps understood something profound about freedom. It is not simply the absence of captivity. It is not simply the ability to move freely or to make choices. Freedom is the recognition by others that you possess inherent worth, that you deserve dignity and care, that your life matters. The American soldiers who liberated them understood this too, perhaps instinctively rather than philosophically. When they addressed the women as ma'am, when they insisted on treating them as human beings, they were not simply being polite. They were performing an act of recognition that contradicted 3 years of systematic negation. The silence that greeted that recognition was the sound of souls remembering themselves, of identities being reconstructed from fragments of human beings crossing back over the boundary that separates persons from objects. It was a moment of transformation as profound as the dehumanization that had preceded it, and it demonstrated that while human dignity can be attacked, while it can be obscured and buried and forgotten, it cannot be permanently erased. It persists, waiting to be recognized, waiting for the voice that calls you by your name and reminds you that you are human, that you have always been human, that you will always be human regardless of what you have endured or what you have been forced to become to survive. The women who fell silent in fear when Americans called them human were not weak. They were survivors who had adapted to survive the unsurvivable. Their silence was not incomprehension, but recognition delayed, overwhelming recognition of a truth they had been forced to forget, that they mattered, that they had names, that they were not numbers but human beings deserving of dignity and care. When they found their voices again, when they began to speak, to express needs, to assert preferences, to become again the people they had been and the new people they would become after trauma, they were performing an act of profound courage. They were choosing to be vulnerable again, to be visible, to claim space in the world. They were choosing to believe that the abundance was real, that the care would continue, that freedom meant not just the absence of captivity, but the presence of recognition, of human connection, of the possibility of a future that contained more than simply survival. That choice to believe again in their own humanity, to accept the recognition offered by others, to rebuild themselves from the wreckage of systematic dehumanization. That choice is the ultimate victory over the ideology that had attempted to reduce them to nothing. It is proof that human dignity, though fragile, though vulnerable to attack, possesses a resilience that outlasts empires, that survives the worst that human beings can inflict upon each other. The women who survived carried forward that proof in their lives, in their choices, in their refusal to be defined entirely by their trauma. They were more than survivors. They were witnesses to the extremes of human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. And in their witness, in their lives, in the stories they told and the silence they kept, they preserved a lesson that echoes across the decades, that to call someone human, to recognize their dignity, to treat them with the care and respect they deserve, these are not small acts. They are revolutionary acts. They are the foundation of civilization. They are the choice that determines whether we live in a world of numbers or a world of names, a world of hierarchy or a world of inherent worth, a world where human dignity is conferred by power or a world where it is recognized as the birthright of every person who draws breath.